Hello, everyone. It's Tuesday, February 3rd. It's just over 12 p.m. here in Montreal, and I want to welcome you all to another episode of the Piar Podcast. Today's programming topic is the art of the possible for Chief Communications Officers. We'll be focusing on the role of the CCO and the realities of what it's like to be in their shoes, both now in 2026 and beyond. As always, I'm your host, Tan Sukhera. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Piar. We're a boutique learning company connecting communications leadership with systems and processes for critical thinking with a goal to radically transform decision quality and judgment. Today's guest is an author, business leader, and trusted advisor who's been a pleasure to connect with. Her recent book, titled Chief Communications Officers at Work, is one I was quick to pick up. It anchors on interviews she's personally conducted with CCOs from large global organizations, and I feel the book does a terrific job of helping readers understand the psychological aspect of how CCOs think and what they're really focused on. Today, I'm excited to unpack some of that and perhaps touch a little bit on topics which are not in the book, but important to speak about. My guest today is Tabita Andersson. Tabita Andersson is a senior communications, brand, and marketing leader in the B2B industry. For over 25 years, she has worked in-house with agencies and as a freelancer to provide communication support, advice, and leadership to build and protect company brand and reputation. She is passionate about the role communications plays in helping a business thrive and how it can help C-level executives connect the dots both inside and outside their organization. Throughout her career, she has seen firsthand how difficult it is for talented communications professionals to make it to the C-level and beyond. At the same time, with the world becoming more volatile and the number of disparate stakeholders growing by the minute, the importance of having a trusted reputation is becoming a vital part of ensuring success for strategies aimed at growing or protecting businesses. Tabita, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me, Tan. I look forward to the conversation.
So, my first question is for CCOs tuning in. The last time that we spoke, when I asked you about a trait that the highest performing CCOs had, one of the things you brought up was this concept of the art of the possible. Could you please explain what that is and why you think fellow CCOs should try to espouse this?
Absolutely. So, with the art of the possible, to me, that means that it's definitely possible for senior communications leaders to make it to the top table and work as part of executive leadership teams. And one of the reasons why I wanted to put together the book was that I feel that there's not enough role models out there. I really have a passion for bringing these role models and these conversations to the general public and to a larger audience to help a community of communications professionals, communications leaders to really have something to aspire to. Because I believe it's possible, hence the art of the possible. And I believe it's possible for senior communications leaders to step forwards and in order to do that, I think we need more role models. We need to see more people that are working at that level. We need to feel what it's like. We need to listen and hear their stories. And we also need to understand the skills that these CCOs have that make them perhaps stand out and be able to make it to the top table. So that's what I mean with the art of the possible. I want to show the profession that, yes, we can make it to the table.
And just on that point, there's a lot of CCO interviews and CEO interviews that talk about the need for the CCO to be a business leader first before a communications leader. Is that an example of the sort of skills that we're talking about here? Like breaking that down, what skills it would take to become a business leader. Is that what you're seeing there in terms of the skills required to espouse that art of the possible?
Absolutely. Business acumen is one of the top skills that came out in all the conversations I had with the CCOs. I think as comms leaders, we tend to be very good, obviously, at the communication side of things. We're good at writing, we're good at speaking, we're good at presenting, perhaps. And I see a lot of comms more junior professions being very good at doing press releases, writing strategic plans, but perhaps who haven't gone outside of that sphere during their career to build the business understanding and management side of things. So I do think that a lot of senior comms leaders get to the position and then start to realize, well, hang on a second, I actually need some additional skills here that I perhaps haven't gained throughout my career. So when I interviewed the CCOs, they had a variety of different ways of gaining those skills. Some kind of went back to school and signed up for courses to try and learn those skills. Others just applied them in house and worked their way around the organization, learning from different functions and departments, from different leaders. And others took side steps in their career. So, one of the CCOs that I interviewed, for example, had a commercial background. That person came from a sales and marketing and business background and then gone into communications, which I thought was really quite interesting. So there's lots of different ways of gaining that business and commercial acumen that you need to be a business leader and not just a comms leader. But it is something that all of the CCOs that I interviewed were very high in their competence about.
Tabita, as part of your research, you set out to investigate whether or not B2B businesses and B2C businesses had inherent differences between how CCOs at those companies had to operate. You mentioned in the findings that the craft really is identical. It's communications. How does communicating with different stakeholder groups potentially blur lines between B2B and B2C? And what do you think are the net effects on reputation?
What I saw from the conversations was that the trade is the same, regardless if it's B2B or B2C organization. We use the same tools, we use the same tips and tricks, but the context differs. So the environments are very different. And we need to learn those environments in order to communicate effectively. So again, the stakeholders, although they tend to be very different, obviously B2B and B2C, in essence, they're also very similar. At the end of the day, they're all people and they're all human beings, and we need to communicate and deal with each other as human beings. You have investors, perhaps in a publicly listed organizations. You have the public in perhaps some of the consumer-oriented organizations. In all types of organizations, we have customers. In all types of organizations, we have employee or internal stakeholders. So the net effect of what we do and the net effect of reputation is in essence the same. We can either build a great reputation or we can protect a great reputation that we already have. All organizations go through crisis situations. In today's world, with whatever's going on, there isn't a single organization that doesn't have any crisis situations. And that is something that communications and senior comms leaders can really play a big part in helping guiding their organizations through these situations, whether they're small crises or large crises. One of the things that came through my conversations was that the best crisis communications or crisis handling sometimes is when a crisis is averted, and that's something that you don't always see. A lot of the work that we do goes on in the background to try and help manage and try and help guide organizations through these situations. So I think it doesn't really matter if you're a B2B or B2C organizations. The complex situations and scenarios that we find ourselves in tend to be the same, and it's got the same impact and effect on reputation. Saying that, some obviously can feel, I guess, the impact of reputation going wrong a bit faster and quicker than other organizations, depending on the type of product that you're selling, depending on the type of public organization you perhaps can be.
That makes me think of a brilliant example I saw recently on the interconnected nature of different stakeholder groups. In the study, they took an example of an higher learning institution and they laid out in basically columns different stakeholders. And so, just like a quick example would be like, just to make it crude and simple, is like students, parents, teachers, institutions, governments, right? And what they were able to do was if you take a standard definition, a textbook definition of what each of these stakeholder groups want, it tends to be different from the hidden realities of incentivization, motivation, simplification, and what let's say, the mantras that you would find on like a mission, vision, values page of a website type of a thing. Those things were actually overturned, and the true incentives and wants and needs of these stakeholders were basically defined. By doing so, they were able to see where the power actually lies. And in that crude example, just to get to the end of it here for you, was that the real power lies in the parents in that scenario because of the different levels of apprehension and, let's say, enthusiasm from the different stakeholders, the push and pull factors, let's call them. And so that sort of reminds me of what you're saying is that whether it's B2B or B2C, the trade is the same, but you're always going to have stakeholders that are both groups, individuals, and so on and so forth. And in your intro, there was a mention of disparate stakeholders growing by the minute. And so I think that connects the dots quite well. What do you think about that example and the way that that's been broken down?
Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned joining the dots. And I think this is where we as communications professionals can play such a big role, because we're often finding ourselves in the situation where we're probably one of the very few that has that bird's eye perspective across an organization. And one of the few people that can connect the dot and what's going on in one area of the organization with another, and being able to negotiate and deploy our communication skills in looking at the priorities of those different stakeholders and make sure that they still are aligned with what we're trying to achieve as an organization. But quite often, we are perhaps the only one, apart from perhaps the CEO, who's got that bird's eye perspective because we work across the entire organization. And often, as well, especially if you're working for a slightly larger organization that perhaps has a very large business portfolio that caters to different target personas, different target markets, you also have to work with stakeholders that are very different across those different business segments. And you could be the only person that could see how someone with a particular need in one business needs to be joined up with another function or another business need, etc. So I think as comms professionals, we have a responsibility and a really good view of being able to join those dots and help the organization with the strategic planning, as well as the communications of those plans. Because I think something else that's really important is to get ahead of decisions. And something that came out throughout my conversations and a lot of the interviews was that it's really important to bring communications in early, not just after a decision has been made and we just need to communicate something, but actually bringing in comms early in the room means that the decisions will be better thought through and thought out. And that is because we can bring that dot connector skills and critical thinking skills because we know and understand the different needs of the different stakeholders.
And so, just the same way that in the last example, we can label one of the critical assumptions that was made was just shallow mapping those stakeholder needs. We could turn it back over to mindset. So, speaking on mindset, you mentioned a common thread among top performing CCOs was a learning mindset. People who always consider themselves to be learners, who are always reading and keeping up with the trends, consuming the news, learning new skills on technology and AI, etc. What advice do you have for fellow CCOs about quickly adopting and learning new skills? Is it a lifestyle thing?
I think so. The conversations that I had, I asked the same question, and everyone was learning in one way or another. I think, I mean, we're obviously everyone's different in terms of how they like to learn. Some read books, others read newsletters, some listen to lots of podcasts. I have to say, there was a lot of interest in listening because it's something that we can do while we're doing something else. But just that kind of um, nose for news, as I'd like to call it, being able to read a lot, to assimilate a lot of information. I think as a good communicator, we also need to be able to assimilate news, assimilate information, and quickly understand how that applies to our organization or our situation. So that forms part of it. We have to always be at the forefront. And I think as personalities as well, we are probably more inclined to be learners, the love of learners, in terms of how we do our jobs too.
You mentioned something really interesting. I think the CCO being uniquely positioned to have that bird's eye view and connect the dots. And as it pertains to learning new functions, it appears that there's a natural positioning that the CCO should be known to be able to do is, well, let's bring in the CCO here early on in this decision because their critical thinking skills add value to the conversation and the planning process. They might be able to spot gaps, blind spots, blockers, view around corners, think a few steps ahead. I've noticed a lot of CCO language around saying we need to think 10 steps ahead. We need to be way out there in advance of understanding what are the effects on the outside environment and ensure that our organization is positioned to succeed in those. But at the same time, it's sort of a contrast with the idea that a lot of these skills, like being able to think strategically in the sense that you're placing bets on what will happen in the future, you're making recommendations to allocate large financial investments to the CEO, CFO, the rest of the C-suite. How do you how do you see CCOs need to reconcile between the two? Do you think it's voraciously focusing on this appetite for learning and really cement their position as that advisor, mentor, leader figure, sharing wisdom, knowledge, that sort of thing? Is it building culture? Or do you think that there's something missing that maybe could be, let's say, interdisciplinary that could be pulled in to assist the CCO with building some more, let's call it, systemization around the thinking and the approach? Do you think it's an inherent thing that, hey, like Tabita's got a great knack for insights, let's call her in? Or is it Tabita's got a sort of a system that she uses? I wonder how that would be applied to this decision.
So I think in the past it's probably been more of the first. I think it's been much more about the advising part of the role, and having a good gut feel for what potentially could go right and wrong. Because you mentioned earlier the seeing around the corners aspect of the role. As CCOs, we work very closely with our legal and risk colleagues a lot because, especially in large publicly listed organizations, you have to be continually looking at what risks are there, what can we do in terms of mitigation. You have to plan for what if something should happen. Crisis comms and crisis planning is a big part of the role. And you can't necessarily plan for every single crisis that's going to come. I think we've seen just in the last few years, nobody knew when COVID hit that we were going to be facing a global pandemic. And that was something that none of us had faced before. So we all kind of had to charter our own ways through figuring out how to deal with those crisis situations. So yes, there is a bit of a system because there are guidelines, there's framework, of course there is, but there's always going to be a part of it that's going to be, well, what if this happened and what if that happens and how do we need to react and where do we need to go? So I don't think you can be overly prescriptive about every single thing. Saying that, I think bringing a bit of what I'd like to call order in chaos is also a good thing. So I do think there are, especially when you start thinking about the way we are more strategic. When I say being more strategic in comms, that to me means bringing systems, processes, a plan, to the table and to what we do, and that kind of strategic thinking, that I think is so valuable for comms. So I don't think it's an either or answer. I think it's a bit of both in an ideal world.
I agree. And I love that you said the what if. scenario, because to me that's the essence of strategy, right? Is if this happens then this would happen, if this happens then this would happen, et cetera. And through modeling or simulations or thought exercises, tabletop exercises, a pre-mortem exercise, different activities with a group setting seems to be I would say, almost like a bit of a superpower at the moment. But I love that it's also got to be done in balance, and that's really something that needs to be respected at all times, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you have to plan for situation, otherwise you're not prepared. So there's always going to be an element of it's much better to be over prepared and over planned than not prepared at all and something when something does happen, because it's always going to. And also it's actually quite fun. I enjoy doing those kind of crisis scenario planning and workshops and kind of meetings. It's quite fun to bring together a team or a group around the table and go, well, what if this happened? What would we do? Because then you're actually planning for it in a time where it feels safe to have the conversations. It actually doesn't matter if something goes wrong around the table because you can correct yourself. So it doing that planning in a fun and safe environment can do a lot for the team morale, can do a lot for the team building and motivation. And it can really set you up for success when something does happen, because you're training a muscle again, and the more you train your muscle, the better it's gonna get. So then when you do need it, it's there and it's strong, and you've got something to lean back on to work together on. And also, I think another aspect of it is that when you do the scenario planning and work together, you also build trust. So once you've built that trust up around with the members in your risk team or crisis team, for example, it gets much. You can work together much faster when something does happen. It was something one of the CEOs that I worked with actually told me when I was chatting with him before writing the book. He said, "Build the trust early, because then when something happens, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to do all the niceties. You can go straight into action." And that is so valuable for the CEO.
That reminds me of an anecdote shared by another speaker on this podcast about a crisis planning scenario where they had the leadership team, the C suite of the organization together to talk about a crisis. And then he was like, wait a minute, where's the comms? Where's the comms function here? And they were like, oh, don't worry, they're working on a rebrand right now. And he chuckled for a second, then he went through the stages of emotions there, right? Where then he was a little sad about it, and then he ultimately ended up roping them in. But that it's with the trust that you can be invited into the room where the decision is being made beforehand. And without that trust and without some tactical ways to build that trust, hopefully it's not a situation where CCOs have rocks that are unturned and are sort of suffering from those inevitable problems when not enough trust is built. And sometimes it happens just by design. A lot of the times we find that there's a very strong correlation between the number of CEO departures and the CCO departure. It sort of happens very closely or in tandem, and I have a sneaky suspicion that it has something to do with the trust element. Any thoughts on that? I'd love to get your comment.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. I think as a CCO, you are working very closely with the CEO. Ultimately, especially if you sit on the exec leadership team, you report into the CEO. You have to work so closely. And I think as anyone know who's changed their manager or the boss, it doesn't matter what level of the organization you are. If your boss changes, your world changes, right? And it takes a while to figure out how to work with the new boss. And that's exactly the same, although I think the challenge gets higher the higher up in the organization you come. Also because you work on so much, the problems and the challenges and the tasks that you work on tend to be magnitude and just larger the higher up in the hierarchy you go. And you become very, you have to become a trusted advisor, you have to also become a trusted confidant. You're working with a lot of confidential information most of the time, especially as a CCO. So you have to work so super closely with your CEO that it does take a mindset and a real skill to change the CEOs. I found over the course of my career that CEOs like to work very differently. So that we're going through that change is it's a big change. You have to try and figure out how your new incoming CEO what they want, what they need, and how they like to work. And it can be completely different from your previous CEO, and that just takes a bit of time to get used to. So yeah, I totally hear you on that challenge.
Now, I want to touch on an important topic while we're still here in Q1 2026, which is the current state of affairs for CCOs. To paint a picture, CEOs know more than ever the importance of communications as a function of the business, yet some research shows a lack of trust between CEOs and communications leadership. And according to LinkedIn, there's a very small amount of executives with the formal title of Chief Communications Officer. So few of such roles exist in comparison to the number of large companies in the world. And we can also see it in the number of jobs. There are very few CCO jobs these days compared to even CMO roles. Yet 2026 undoubtedly shows unprecedented opportunities for CCOs to grow and cement themselves in their respective organizations. All this said, for those communications leaders who aspire one day to become CCO, the newly appointed CCOs, and even for those who are well tenured CCOs currently, from your perspective, Tabita, what opportunities do you see out there for the profession right now? And are there any linkages to this in the CCO interviews that you've already conducted in your book?
So this is something that I am very passionate about because I believe that we should have a lot more senior comms leaders being appointed into CCO roles and working much more closely with CEOs and leadership team. I think there's a real missed opportunities for CEOs out there. And I would love to see more senior comms leader roles open up in the future. It's something I'm very, very passionate about. And I think it's not necessarily just the CEO that's got a role to play here. I think every C leader has a role to play. Quite often, especially if you come from the B2B tech world that I do, you see comms sit as part of marketing. And I think the CMO has a really wonderful role to play in bringing the comms leader to the table and making sure that they're using the wide range of skills that their comms leaders have to work with the CEO, to work with the other C leaders of an organization, and for the CEO or the CMO or any other C leader to understand that there's so much more to the senior comms leader in their company than perhaps what they first thought. So I'm very passionate in trying to see how we can open up more roles for senior comms leaders around the world because I think it's sorely needed. I think from a perspective of all stakeholders within an organization. And then on to then think about the comms leader themselves, I think we have an opportunity of stepping forwards. So being proactive ourselves and stepping into that sort of higher level of guiding communications and guiding an organization, it's not necessarily something we're always asked to do. Sometimes we have to step forward and do it. And we have to be proactive and reaching out and building relationship with our C leaders and getting time in front of the executives and the leaders of a company and bringing ourselves to it and bringing the value of what we can do. So I think we also have the opportunity of doing a better job ourselves and not shy away from it, and perhaps go back into the safe place of our media relations or internal comms or whatever our safe place might be, but actually putting ourselves forward and take that step forward and say, hey, I'm going to start building relationship with the next level up in the hierarchy, for example, or the boss's boss, or whatever it might be. So I think there's dual ways we can do this. Now, saying all of that, I also think we are doing so much better as a profession than what we were. And a lot of the conversations I had with CCOs, then they all agreed with that as well. If we look back 10, 15 years, you there wasn't a CCO out there. I think you could probably count them on one hand. So I think we're going in the right direction. I think we're starting to cement it as a role, but I think we've got a long way to go to get to the same level as, say, for example, a CMO today.
Well, it looks like there's a great opportunity here to take initiative, to stop and pause and think before doing the actual working part to ensure that when you do jump into the working part, it's effective and you build trust, as you were saying earlier, Tabita. And by networking up and showing that you're competent, you build this confidence, and hopefully that will be a trigger point to help to open up more roles inside of these organizations. But it looks like it's not going to be something that happens automatically. It's something that we as a professional need to earn essentially from those role models that you mentioned at the top, isn't it?
It is. I think it's a dual action really, pincer movement, if you like, whereby we can take the step up, and I think CEOs and C-level execs also need to open their mind up to the value that a good comms leader will bring to an organization in terms of reputation.
So we need to conclude here. I hope you found this insightful, and I hope to see growth and more support for CCOs in the future. I'm confident that things are good on the horizon for those who can think deeply and create those systems that we talked about that meet the needs of this new order that we all find ourselves in today. Tabita, first, I want to say on the record, thank you so much for writing that book. It's a treat, and it's been a pleasure to exchange ideas with you today.
You're very welcome, Tan. It's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.